Dan, I'm not happy. I want a divorce. The words landed like a wrecking ball, but I can't claim they came out of nowhere. After almost 20 years of marriage, I'd noticed Susan leaning heavily on her friend Karen, too heavily, if I'm honest. Karen, self-proclaimed relationship expert, had a history of 3 divorces, which seemed to qualify her as a sage in Susan's eyes. Dan, are you even listening? I said I want a divorce. I drew in a slow, steady breath, letting her words sink in. Yes, Susan, I heard you, I replied. But this isn't the kind of thing I'm going to respond to without some thought. I've tried to be a good husband and father. As far as I know, we've been okay. So I can't help wondering where it all went wrong. After a moment, I added, if our marriage isn't making you happy anymore, as much as it hurts, I'll support your decision. But tell me, Susan, is this something you've been holding on to for a while, or did it just hit you recently? She hesitated only briefly before admitting, it's been building for a while. I need space, Dan. I need to figure out who I am, maybe even meet new people. She spoke like she had rehearsed the line a dozen times. From what I've read, we need to be legally separated for at least 90 days before finalizing anything. Who knows? Maybe during that time, I'll realize I don't actually want a divorce. I nodded thoughtfully, recalling stories of others' separations. So, during these 90 days, we can both see other people, and it won't count as cheating. But at the end, if either one of us wants to finalize the divorce, it happens, regardless of what the other wants. Her face shifted slightly, as if she hadn't fully considered what equal footing meant. Well, yeah, I guess, she muttered. And if I file for separation too, I pressed, that gives me the same power to choose whether to keep or end the marriage, right? Susan faltered for the first time. Sure. I just thought I was clear about wanting the divorce. Look, I said, keeping my tone calm, I don't want a divorce, but I won't stop you if that's where your heart is leading you. Just to keep things fair, I'll file too. So we're starting from the same place. She blinked, looking almost disoriented. Wait, does that mean you actually want this too? She asked, a note of surprise in her voice. Not really, I answered honestly. But it seems I've been fooling myself about how well I've been meeting your needs as a husband and father. Her features softened for a moment before she turned distant again. You've been wonderful, Dan. I want something new. Freedom, I guess. And a separation will help me explore that. I swallowed the lump in my throat. The fact that you need something I can't give, that says it all, doesn't it? A heavy silence hung between us before I asked, have you already contacted a lawyer? She waved off my question, as if it were trivial. Not yet, but I'm planning to talk to Greg Miller, Karen's divorce attorney. Karen's fingerprints, smudging their way into my marriage. I fought the urge to roll my eyes. Well, I think I'll call my cousin Rachel to handle my side. Susan's expression twisted. Rachel? Really? She's intense, Dan. Yeah, I know she's a lot, I said evenly, but she's also fiercely loyal. And she's great at what she does. I thought back to the last family gathering when Rachel had jokingly offered her legal services after a few glasses of wine. Looks like I might take her up on that, I added, a grim smirk tugging at the corner of my mouth. All right then, I continued. Let's use the next couple of weeks to prepare for the separation. We'll aim to start at the beginning of next month. Susan looked puzzled. Why do we need prep time? Isn't the separation just about figuring out if divorce is what we really want? Exactly, I replied. But without a bit of structure, it'll just be chaos. We need to set the stage so we both know what we're walking into. That makes sense? She nodded slowly, though her eyes seemed far away, as if the conversation had already drifted into the past. She hesitated before giving a small nod. Yeah, maybe. I hadn't really thought it through. I noticed a flicker of uncertainty pass across her face. Tell you what, I said, stepping out of the bedroom and heading toward the kitchen. Let's sit down and make a list of everything we need to figure out. I'll get some coffee going. I left her there, giving her a moment to let the weight of our conversation settle. By the time she joined me in the kitchen, the coffee machine was humming, and I was scribbling notes in a notepad. There's a lot to work out, I said, glancing up at her. Let's start with the kids. She frowned. What do you mean? I mean, We need to decide how we're going to tell them. They need to know this isn't their fault, and we have to present a united front. She bit her lip, looking uneasy. I don't know, Dan. I don't think they'll take it well, and I'm not sure they even need to know yet. Why don't we wait out the 90 days and see where we land? I shook my head. They'll notice something's up. If we don't handle it the right way, it could end up being even harder for them. We need to have a plan for what we'll say. To help keep things as normal as possible for the kids, I suggested, how about you stay in the house during the separation? That way, we can minimize the changes for them. Maybe we could even spend some time together as a family, so they don't feel like everything's falling apart. Susan's face tightened. But how would that work with dating or maintaining any kind of social life? One of us staying in while the other goes out would only lead to resentment. This separation is supposed to be a glimpse into post-divorce life, not more of the same dynamic. She had a point. You're right. If they saw either of us with someone else, it would be confusing for them. We agreed to approach the topic with care, emphasizing to the girls that we both loved them and that none of this was their fault. As we talked about how family and friends might interpret the situation, we acknowledged the risk of rumors. We'd have to make it clear that this wasn't about infidelity or anyone's wrongdoing. Susan and I also discussed counseling for the girls. While we hoped they'd adapt, we didn't want to underestimate the emotional toll this might take on them. I even tried to lighten the mood, joking, if we both end up with new partners, the girls might score extra grandparents. More presents at Christmas and birthdays, right? But the thought of coordinating holidays hit us hard. Birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all of it would need careful planning. I brought up another touchy subject, discretion. If either of us starts seeing someone, we can't bring them to the house, especially when the kids are around. That would only confuse them. Susan's lips tightened, but she nodded. Next, we tackled money. We'll both need to adjust to managing separate households, I said matter-of-factly. 2 homes would mean higher expenses, and Susan's expression turned strained. We'll have to divide our assets, close shared accounts, and figure out a child support arrangement to keep the girls' lives as stable as possible. Susan stared at me as I outlined all the logistics. There's a lot to think through before we even start the separation, I said. I'll start looking for an apartment close to work so the girls can stay with me comfortably when it's my turn. I explained that standard visitation usually meant seeing the kids every other weekend and alternating holidays. But I want to stay involved in their everyday lives, not just show up on weekends. Susan raised an eyebrow. I'm surprised you're not already dating, considering how much time you spend with the girls, she remarked dryly. I'm not in any rush to date seriously, I replied. I'm not disappearing from their lives, Susan. I reminded her that if she planned to move on with a new partner, she'd need to be prepared to take on some of the responsibilities I'd been managing. We even touched on the challenges of midweek visits, homework, school schedules, and the logistics of getting the girls back and forth. Practical issues loomed large. Transportation, splitting the girls' belongings between 2 homes, coordinating bus routes. It all added up. Susan's irritation became more apparent as she realized I wasn't going to just fade into the background. If anything, I was digging in to make sure I stayed a fully present father, no matter how the separation played out. This isn't how Karen described it, she muttered under her breath, frustration flickering across her face. Apparently, her friend had painted a neat little picture where I'd roll over, keep the household running smoothly, and let her explore her options without much fuss. But now that things weren't falling into place, Susan seemed genuinely thrown. Well, Dan, she said at last, sounding weary, I need to sleep on this. I'm heading to bed. Maybe we can talk more tomorrow. Sure thing, Sue, I replied, though I had no plans to turn in yet. I want to jot down a few more thoughts before calling it a night. The more we plan now, the easier things will go later. I watched as she trudged down the hall, clearly drained. Good night, Sue, I said softly, though she was already out of earshot. Susan hardly slept that night. I could hear her shifting and turning through the walls. Meanwhile, I stayed up long enough to get my thoughts in order, then crashed in the guest room, leaving her to stew on the conversation. Sure enough, the next morning when she woke up, she noticed my absence and assumed I'd spent the whole night working on our divorce checklist. She wandered into the kitchen, only to find my notepad sitting on the table and no sign of me. While her breakfast cooked, Susan's curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the notepad and skimmed through it. I'd labeled the page liabilities to address and laid out everything in painstaking detail. Mortgage adjustments, homeowner's insurance, utilities, water, gas, electric, cable, internet, even minor expenses like streaming services. Every logistical piece of separating our lives was there. The list clearly annoyed her. The next page held an outline of projected expenses for my apartment and estimated child support to maintain the girls' current lifestyle. The numbers weren't promising. There'd be a shortfall of a few $100s every month. I'd even jotted down ideas for cutting costs, like giving up my Starbucks runs and eating out less often. To my surprise, Susan had added her own notes, her gym membership, meals out, and a women's networking group she joined. Clearly, she wasn't planning on cutting back. Another section focused on the girls, extracurriculars, school supplies, and other expenses they might have. I knew Susan's freedom plan didn't account for how the separation would impact them, so I made sure it was spelled out in black and white. Then there was my personal favorite, a page listing all the household tasks I typically handled: car maintenance, mowing the lawn, calling the plumber, fixing the HVAC, refueling her car, grocery shopping, you name it. All of it would now fall squarely on her shoulders. As Susan stared at the notepad, visibly frustrated, I imagined the gears turning in her head. "Why isn't Dan doing what he's supposed to?" she muttered. "Why won't he just give me what I want?" Her irritation was palpable as she grabbed her phone and tiptoed out of the kitchen to call Karen. "Hey, Karen, it's me," she whispered, clearly not wanting me to overhear. "I have to keep my voice down. Dan's still asleep in the other room." Karen's voice came through the speaker, far too eager. "So, how did it go? Did he break down and promise to do whatever it takes to win you back?" Instead of the triumphant tone Karen was expecting, Susan sounded annoyed. "No," she admitted. "He actually agreed to the separation without a fight and spent the whole night making lists of everything he does that I'd have to take over if we go through with it." Susan sighed, continuing, "He's planning to get his own place and treat this like a full-on trial divorce. He says it's the best way to decide if we want to finalize it after the 90 days. He's acting like divorcing me doesn't even faze him. Honestly, it's throwing me off." Karen laughed dismissively. "Oh, Sue, he's bluffing. This is all about control. He wants you to feel like you can't live without him. Don't fall for it. Remember, you've got the ultimate leverage, your kids and, well, the bedroom. Play your cards right, and you'll be spending weekends with Mark in no time while Dan handles the grunt work at home." Susan hesitated. "I hope you're right," she murmured, though she seemed less certain than before. "Dan's not making any big moves yet, so I guess I'll just hold steady and see what happens next." At that moment, I stirred in the guest room, and Susan abruptly ended the call. "I've got to go, Karen. He's up. Talk later." I shuffled into the kitchen, still groggy, and Susan greeted me in a strangely casual tone. "Hey, Dan, want some coffee?" "No thanks," I muttered, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "Not a great idea this late. I barely slept as it is. Why didn't you come to bed?" She bit her lip, watching Dan lean against the counter before finally answering. "I needed some air. Took a walk," he said quietly. "Honestly, I didn't trust myself. I saw you lying there, looking beautiful, and I thought, well, I didn't want us to end up in bed just because you felt bad for me." "But Dan," she urged gently, "we're still married. For now, I'm still yours. Shouldn't we still be together until the separation is finalized?" "I'm sorry, Sue," he replied, shaking his head slowly. "I can't pretend things are normal. You've already said you're unhappy, and as much as it hurts, I have to respect that and give you the space you want. This separation needs a clean start." He exhaled deeply, a note of resignation in his voice. "It's going to be hard, but more than anything, I want you to be happy, even if it's not with me." Susan placed a hand on his arm, her tone soft but insistent. "Just because we're separating doesn't mean we're heading for divorce, Dan. Can't you give me time to figure this out? Maybe this distance will help us come back stronger." Dan's expression remained skeptical. "Sure, Sue. I'd like to believe that, but I don't see it. I'll take the day off and start making arrangements. Billy can handle the crew today." I'll set up new accounts and begin sorting out finances. He glanced at the clock and added, don't worry about the girls. I'll make breakfast and take them to school. You can get to work on time. Later that morning, Mark, her charming coworker, strolled by Susan's office with his usual confident grin. Got a free evening? Thought we could grab drinks and unwind, he suggested. Susan felt a spark of excitement but brushed it off, her mind briefly flashing to the elevator encounter they'd shared. The rush she felt when Mark was around stood in stark contrast to the tangled mess of her marriage. That evening, she came home to find signs that Dan had been there. An empty coffee mug in the sink, the faint smell of his cologne lingering. Oddly, it gave her a small sense of relief. At least he hadn't started packing his things. All right, she thought, 90 days of freedom. We'll stay married for now, and I'll figure out how to keep things with Mark discreet. Settling at the kitchen table, she glanced at Dan's notepad, intending to review the to-do list. But a new page caught her eye, potential relationships to explore. It was divided into 2 columns, women who've expressed interest and women I'd be curious about. Her stomach twisted when she spotted her sister Sarah's name at the very top of the first column. Furious, Susan snatched her phone and dialed. Hello? Susan? Sarah answered, sounding puzzled. How could you? Susan snapped. Are you seriously trying to steal my husband? Wait, what? Sarah asked, her tone shifting to confusion. Dan has a list, Sarah. Your name's on it, under women who've expressed interest. Care to explain? Sarah sighed, unfazed. Oh, that? I might have told him once, after a few drinks, that if you ever left him, I'd consider it. Honestly, Sue, he deserves better than how you've been treating him. Susan was caught off guard. Wait, you're saying you're seriously interested in Dan? Maybe I am, Sarah said bluntly. What's this about a list, anyway? Are things that bad? Or is Dan the one stepping out? That's not the point, Susan stammered. I just said I needed time to explore what I want. Sarah let out a dry laugh. Right. So, who's the guy, Sue? Mark? Or someone else? No one, Susan retorted. Dan and I agreed on a 90-day separation to figure things out. Sarah didn't seem convinced. Well, if Dan's separating legally, that means he'll be a free man soon. And if that happens, I'd be more than happy to see where things go with him. Susan was stunned. I've been a good wife, Sarah. This was my decision, not his. He's been fine. A great father, a good husband, a provider. Then act like it, Sarah said sharply. Because if you throw him away, don't be surprised if someone else steps in. Men like Dan aren't easy to find, and if you're too busy chasing something else, I won't hesitate to take my shot. With that, Sarah hung up, leaving Susan seething. She knew she'd taken Dan for granted, but hearing her sister openly declare her interest in him made things feel alarmingly real. Her eyes drifted back to the list. A name in the second column caught her attention. Tina, Dan's secretary, a single mom barely in her mid-20s. Susan felt a pang of discomfort imagining Tina seeing Dan as a reliable, stable partner for her and her child. Other names followed, some she recognized from around town. One even had a bold M scribbled next to it, marking her as married. The realization hit hard. Dan wasn't waiting on her anymore. He was preparing for a life that didn't include her, and Susan wasn't sure she liked the idea of being left behind. Linda had always known that Tom held a psychology degree, though he'd chosen a career in the trades. He'd built a thriving business, managing 3 teams, but now she couldn't shake the thought that he might be applying his skills in ways she hadn't anticipated. The unnamed women on his list, Waffle House waitress, Starbucks barista, Walmart clerk, left her wondering just how many found him as appealing as her own sister apparently did. She hadn't expected him to consider moving on so quickly during their separation, but the evidence suggested he was already laying the groundwork. Just as her irritation reached its peak, Tom walked in and caught her reading through his notes. Her face was tight with anger, and he seemed to brace himself for the inevitable confrontation. Couldn't wait to start lining up replacements, could you? Linda snapped, her tone dripping with accusation. And my sister? Really? Tom met her glare with a calm, measured look. Just trying to keep up with your boyfriend search, he said evenly. What are you talking about? She huffed. I don't have a boyfriend. I just needed some space to figure things out. Sure, Tom replied, his voice cool. What about Mark Benson? Her composure faltered. How do you know about him? She demanded. Well, Tom began, leaning casually against the counter. I ran into Denise, your boss's secretary, at Walmart. She's quite the chatterbox. Linda bristled. And what? You just took her word for it? Tom shrugged. She mentioned that you and Mark seem pretty friendly. Apparently, you have lunch together almost every day, and he's in your office more than the cleaning crew. He's an old friend from college, Linda replied defensively. We've been catching up, that's all. Tom didn't buy it. Right. So is he part of the exploring new connections phase of this separation? Linda avoided his gaze. It's not serious, she muttered. We just talk. He's someone who makes me feel appreciated, especially when I'm having a rough day. Tom raised an eyebrow. And does his wife appreciate how he makes you feel? Linda's head snapped up. What are you talking about? Tom tapped his fingers on the counter. Mark Benson, married to Laura, 2 kids. Found his Facebook profile pretty easily. Her face paled. You're lying. He never told me he was married. 3 days ago, his wife posted a picture of them looking very cozy, Tom added, watching her squirm. Linda's shoulders stiffened. I didn't know, she insisted. I would never intentionally ruin someone's marriage. But you're okay with ruining ours? Tom countered, his tone cutting. The room fell silent, tension crackling between them. Mark had been the reason Linda had considered leaving Tom, but she wasn't about to admit that. He's just one of several people I've met, she deflected. If you can make a list, so can I. Tom's eyes narrowed. Fine, but if we're both exploring, we should get checked for STDs. Can't be too careful. Tom, that's disgusting, Linda snapped, her cheeks flushing. It's just practical, he replied. I wasn't planning to see anyone, but if the situation changes, I want to be safe. Linda fumed silently, but Tom moved on. Anyway, I promised to keep you updated on the separation arrangements. I started working on the finances today. The big update is about the apartment. Oh. Linda forced herself to sound casual, though her stomach tightened. Tina, my secretary, manages a few units part-time at Royal Arms Apartments. They've got a 2-bedroom near my office. She offered me a 50% discount if I help out with some maintenance work. Linda felt a flash of jealousy. Not only was Tom planning to move out, but the arrangement would put him in close proximity to Tina, a younger, single mother who clearly admired him. It's a practical move, Tom continued. More money for the kids, less stress for me. Seems like a win-win. Linda's eyes narrowed. But you haven't signed the lease yet, have you? We still have 90 days. Maybe there's a chance we can work things out. No, I haven't signed anything, Tom said calmly. But Tina already knows about the separation. She even offered to leave her job if it made me uncomfortable. Linda's jaw tightened. And that's why she's on your list, I assume? Exactly, Tom replied without hesitation. I told her I wasn't interested, workplace policy and all. But she seemed insistent. His tone was light, but Linda could feel the underlying jab. Before Linda could respond, Tom changed the subject. There's something else I need to mention. I booked 2 tickets for Hawaii months ago. It was supposed to be a surprise for our 20th anniversary. Linda's expression brightened. Hawaii? Tom, that's my dream vacation. I've always wanted to go. Tom didn't smile. When you brought up divorce, I realized we might not make it to 20 years. I tried to cancel the trip, but I could only get a partial refund. Linda's face fell. So, no Hawaii? I transferred the tickets to your name, Tom said, his voice steady. You can take someone else, maybe Mark. Consider it a parting gift. The words hit Linda like a slap, leaving her speechless as Tom walked away. Linda's face turned pale as she stared at Tom, her bravado faltering. She clutched the edge of the table, unable to summon a retort. Well, she stammered, her voice losing its edge. I didn't think you'd actually planned it. Nora's voice continued cheerfully from the speaker. Oh, it was a beautiful package. 10 days at a 5-star resort on Maui, with beachfront access, snorkeling, and even a couple's massage included. Mr. Foster spared no expense. He even had a special anniversary dinner planned for your first night there. Linda's stomach churned as guilt surged through her. Thank you, Nora, she said quickly, cutting her off. That's all I needed to know. Tom ended the call and slipped his phone into his pocket. He met Linda's eyes, his expression unreadable. So, he said evenly, do you still think it's all a scam? Or are you ready to accept that I genuinely wanted to celebrate 20 years with you? Linda floundered for words, her confidence replaced by a creeping sense of shame. I didn't know, Tom. I thought you were just trying to manipulate me. Tom let out a quiet sigh. I planned that trip because I believed we still had a future together, Linda. But I see now that the future you want doesn't include me. That's okay. I'll respect your decision. But don't accuse me of lying when all I've done is try to keep this family together. Linda opened her mouth to argue but stopped herself, realizing she had no defense. The weight of her choices bore down on her as she sat in silence. I'm heading to the apartment to drop these off, Tom said, lifting his suitcase. I'll be back to make dinner for the girls. Let me know if there's anything else you need. As he walked out the door, Linda's chest tightened. She glanced at her phone, her thumb hovering over Rachel's number, but she hesitated. Rachel's words, once comforting, now felt hollow. Linda stood there, torn between pride and regret, the sound of Tom's car fading into the distance. For the first time, she wondered if she pushed too far, if the life she thought she wanted was really worth losing everything she already had. Linda hung up the phone, her hands trembling as her parents' devastated voices echoed in her mind. She turned to Tom, her expression a volatile mix of anger, shame, and desperation. So, that's your plan, she spat. Turn my own parents against me? Make me out to be the villain while you play the doting son-in-law? Tom shook his head, his calm demeanor unwavering. No, Linda. You did that yourself when you decided to dismantle our marriage over some fantasy about finding yourself. I didn't ask them to take sides, but they deserve to know the truth. Her defenses rose instantly. The truth? You're twisting things to make me look bad. I just needed time to figure out what I want, and now you've gone and dragged everyone into this mess. Tom crossed his arms, leaning against the counter. You wanted space, Linda. That's what I'm giving you. But space doesn't mean you get to rewrite the narrative to suit yourself. I've been upfront, and now you're upset that the people who care about us see the cracks in your story. Linda's chest tightened. You don't get it, Tom. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I didn't think things would spiral like this. Tom's voice softened, though his words still carried weight. You didn't think it through at all. That's the problem, Linda. You wanted to press pause on our marriage without realizing that the world doesn't stop turning just because you're unsure about your choices. Other people are affected. Our kids, your parents, me. Linda turned away, gripping the back of a kitchen chair. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she muttered. Maybe I made a mistake. Tom raised an eyebrow. Maybe. She looked over her shoulder, her eyes pleading. I'll cancel the separation. Let's just go back to how things were. We can take the trip to Hawaii together and forget this whole thing happened. Tom's jaw tightened as he considered her words. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Linda, he said finally, his voice steady but resolute, I can't just undo the damage that's been done. You wanted a separation because you were unhappy, and I've spent months watching you drift away. Even if we go to Hawaii, the cracks won't magically disappear. Tears welled up in Linda's eyes. I don't want to lose you, Tom. I thought I did, but now I'm not so sure. Tom exhaled, his expression a mix of sadness and exhaustion. Linda, I've loved you for 20 years, and I've tried my best to be the husband and father you needed. But love isn't a one-way street. You've been chasing something outside of this family, and I'm not sure I can be the person who waits for you to figure it out anymore. She stepped closer, reaching for his hand. Tom, please. Let's try again. For the girls. For us. Tom looked down at her hand, then back into her eyes. If we try again, it has to be real, Linda. No maybes, no figuring it out. I need to know that you're committed, not just afraid of being alone. Linda hesitated, her thoughts racing. She wanted to say yes, to promise him the certainty he deserved, but doubts lingered in the back of her mind. I think I can do that, she said, her voice faltering. Tom's eyes hardened slightly. That's not enough, Linda. When you know for sure, let me know. Until then, I'm going to move forward. For me, for the girls. He turned and walked toward the door, suitcase still in hand. Linda's voice broke as she called after him. Tom, wait. He paused but didn't look back. Linda, I'll always care for you. But I can't wait forever. With that, he stepped out, leaving Linda standing alone in the kitchen, her world unraveling faster than she'd ever imagined. Linda sat in the silence of the living room, her heart pounding as she processed what she had just done. The weight of her conversation with Rachel seemed to lift immediately, replaced by a cautious optimism. She was desperate to make things right, even if it meant swallowing her pride and facing the mess she had created. She grabbed a pen and notebook from the kitchen drawer and sat at the table. Tom's demands played over in her mind. A written apology, a message to Mark, a list of reasons to save the marriage, and cutting Rachel out for good. Each step felt monumental, but she was determined. Linda began her apology, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote, Tom, I am so sorry for everything I've done to hurt you. I allowed doubt and outside influences to cloud my judgment, and I betrayed the trust we built over 2 decades. I let myself become someone I'm not, someone who didn't appreciate the life and love we've shared. You've been a loyal, hardworking, and loving husband and father, and I took you for granted. Please know that I am deeply ashamed of my actions and regret the pain I've caused you and our family. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me, I promise to dedicate myself to rebuilding what I've broken. Tears dotted the paper as she finished, but she pushed through, moving on to Tom's second request. Pulling out her phone, she typed a curt, deliberate message. Mark, I am ending all contact with you immediately. Our interactions were inappropriate, and I deeply regret allowing them to happen. Any further attempts to reach me, through work or otherwise, will result in legal action. Do not contact me again. She hesitated before pressing send, her finger hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, she tapped the button, watching as the message delivered. A sense of finality settled over her. Next, she turned to the list of reasons Tom should stay with her. This task felt the most daunting, as it forced her to confront her failings and remind herself why their marriage mattered. We've built a beautiful family together, and our daughters need both of us as strong, united parents. You are my best friend and the person I've always leaned on during life's challenges. I am willing to change and to earn back your trust, no matter how long it takes. We have decades of shared memories, love, and accomplishments that are worth fighting for. I love you, Tom, and I realize now that I've always loved you. I just lost sight of what matters. Linda read over the list, her chest tightening as she felt the raw truth of her words. She folded the paper and placed it carefully next to the apology. The final task loomed, but Linda felt more resolved now than ever. Picking up her phone, she dialed Rachel. Linda. Rachel answered brightly. What's going on? Did you finally kick Tom to the curb? Rachel, stop, Linda said firmly. Her voice didn't waver this time. Listening to you was the worst mistake of my life. I've nearly destroyed my marriage because of your terrible advice. I'm cutting ties with you, effective immediately. Don't call, don't text, and don't come near me or my family. We're done. Rachel's shocked silence was satisfying, but Linda didn't linger. She ended the call and blocked Rachel's number, setting the phone aside with a sense of finality. When Tom returned at 7, Linda was ready. She placed the written apology, the list, and her phone, open to Mark's blocked contact, on the kitchen table. She stood as he entered, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. Tom glanced at the table, his eyes scanning the papers before meeting hers. You did everything? He asked, his tone neutral. Yes, Linda said quietly. I called Rachel, and I blocked Mark. I wrote the apology and the list. I've done everything you asked, Tom, because I want to fix this. Tom sat down and read through the notes in silence. The tension in the air was almost unbearable as Linda waited for his reaction. Finally, he looked up, his expression softening slightly. I can see that you're trying, Linda, he said. But this isn't about checking off boxes. It's about proving that you're committed to making things right for me, for the girls, and for yourself. Linda nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I know, Tom, and I'm ready to prove it. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll do it. Tom sat back, his gaze steady. We'll take it one step at a time. For now, I'll stay at the apartment until I feel like we've truly started to rebuild. But I'll be here for the girls, and we'll work on this together. Agreed? Agreed, Linda whispered, relief washing over her. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for the first time in months, she felt hope. Linda's tears slowed as Tom's words sunk in, her breath catching at the unexpected offer. She felt as though a lifeline had been tossed her way, just when she thought she'd lost everything. A date, she whispered, her voice shaky but tinged with hope. You really want to try again? Tom nodded, his expression soft but serious. We've been together for 20 years, Linda. That's a lot to walk away from without giving it one last shot. But we need to do this differently. No pretending things are fine or sweeping problems under the rug. If we're going to rebuild, we start fresh, with honesty. Linda wiped her face, her hands trembling. I'll do whatever it takes, Tom. I swear. I won't let you down again. Tom's smile was faint but real, and for the first time in weeks, it seemed as though the icy wall between them had begun to thaw. Dinner Friday, he said, his tone firm but kind. No pressure, no drama. Just us, seeing where we stand. Linda nodded eagerly, the weight on her chest lifting. I'll be ready. Tom stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. And Linda? Between now and then, I need you to focus on yourself, not just fixing things for me. Reflect on what you want, not what Rachel, Mark, or anyone else thinks you should want. This has to be real for both of us. She nodded again, her eyes locked on his. I will, Tom. I promise. As he turned to leave, Linda felt a flicker of hope ignite within her. For the first time in a long while, she believed there might still be a future for them. A different one, perhaps, but a future nonetheless. And as the door closed behind him, Linda sat down to plan for Friday night, determined to prove to Tom and herself that she was ready for a fresh start.